A billionaire handed 4 women unlimited credit cards and told them they could spend as much as they wanted for 3 days. The first woman rushed to luxury boutiques. The second bought jewelry before she even left downtown. The third booked a vacation worth more than most people earn in a year. But the fourth woman wasn't supposed to be part of the test at all. She was the maid. And the envelope she received was different from everyone else's. It had no name. No instructions. No explanation. Just a black card and a handwritten note. When the billionaire saw what she did next, he immediately cancelled his plans, left an important business meeting, and began investigating something hidden inside his own household. Because what the maid discovered would expose a secret nobody in that mansion was prepared to face. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, go ahead and click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos here on Folktales by Amos. His name was Warren Caldwell. 56 years old. Self-made in the truest sense of that phrase, not inherited, not handed anything, built from nothing with his own hands and his own stubbornness and a work ethic that had cost him more than he sometimes liked to admit. He had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist father who smelled like metal shavings and a mother who worked the front desk at an elementary school and packed his lunch every single morning until he left for college, never once complaining about it. Warren had taken everything his parents modeled, discipline, consistency, the dignity of showing up, and he had applied it to business with a focus that bordered on obsession. By the time he was 40 years old, he owned 11 commercial real estate properties across 4 states and a private construction company that employed more than 600 people. By the time he was 56, he had a house in Nashville he rarely used, a vacation cabin in Asheville he visited twice a year if he was lucky, and a primary residence in a gated community outside Atlanta that was, by any honest measure, far too large for one man living alone. He had been divorced for 8 years. It had been a quiet divorce, as divorces go, no dramatic scene, no single catastrophic moment, just 2 people who had built their lives alongside each other and woken up one morning to realize they had done it so efficiently that they had forgotten to build a life together. His only daughter, Sloane, was 24 and living in Seattle. She was bright and independent and had her mother's eyes, and Warren spoke to her every Sunday evening. The calls lasted between 12 and 20 minutes. He told himself that was enough. There were a lot of things Warren Caldwell told himself were enough. The Atlanta house had 4 regular staff. There was Dale, a groundskeeper who had been with him for 6 years and had the calm, unhurried manner of a man who understood that things grew in their own time. There was Marcus, a part-time chef who came 3 days a week and cooked with the kind of quiet pride that made even a simple Tuesday dinner feel like something worth sitting down for. There was Patricia, the house manager, who kept the property running with a precision Warren respected enormously and who had strong opinions about everything from linen quality to the correct temperature for a dining room, and was usually right. And then there was Ruby. Ruby Simmons. 51 years old. Originally from Macon, Georgia. She had been cleaning that house since the year Warren moved in, which meant she had now spent 11 years walking those floors, knowing every room, every corner, every peculiarity of that building the way you only know a place when you have cared for it consistently and without pretense. She arrived every weekday at 7:15 in the morning, and she left every afternoon at 3:30, and in 11 years she had been late exactly twice, once because of a car accident blocking the highway, and once because her grandson had been in the hospital overnight and she had stayed until she knew he was stable before coming in the next morning, still tired, without a word of complaint. Ruby was quiet. Not shy, there is a difference. She was the kind of quiet that belongs to people who have learned to listen more than they speak, because they have found that listening tends to tell you more. She greeted Warren every morning. She answered questions fully when asked. She occasionally said something dry and understated that turned out, on reflection, to be funny. But she did not offer information about herself unless it was invited, and Warren, in 11 years of sharing a house with her 5 days a week, had never thought to invite much of it. He knew she had a grandson. He knew she drove a silver Nissan that had seen better days. He knew she took her coffee with 2 sugars and drank it at the kitchen counter in the first 10 minutes of her morning before she began work. Beyond that, her life outside those walls was a room he had simply never opened the door to. Not out of cruelty. Out of the particular kind of blindness that grows in people who are very busy and very comfortable and have gradually stopped noticing the full humanity of the people around them. The idea for the experiment came from a retirement party. Not his own. He was a long way from thinking about that, but the retirement party of a man named Gerald Holt, who had been Warren's VP of operations for 14 years and was one of the most competent and quietly decent people Warren had ever worked with. Gerald turned 63 that spring, and the party was warm and full of people who genuinely liked him, and Warren gave a speech that he had prepared carefully and delivered well. He said all the right things. He meant them. But on the drive home, something settled over him that took several days to fully identify. It was the uncomfortable realization that in 14 years of working closely with Gerald Holt, he had never once asked Gerald what he actually wanted his life to look like. He had assumed Gerald was satisfied because Gerald never said otherwise. He had assumed a great many things about a great many people, and sitting alone in his car on a dark highway outside Atlanta, he wasn't sure those assumptions had been fair. The thought followed him. Not loudly. Warren was not a man given to dramatic internal crises, but steadily, the way water follows a crack in stone. He found himself watching the people around him differently. Listening more carefully. And after about 6 weeks of this, the old idea came back. He had done it twice before in his life, given people access to money and watched what they reached for, and both times it had told him something true about who those people were underneath the version of themselves they presented to the world. He decided to do it again. Not to expose anyone. Not to catch anyone doing something wrong. Simply to understand something about the people closest to him. What mattered to them. What they chose when the choosing was entirely their own. He arranged it carefully. For black Amex cards, issued through a personal banking relationship, each one backed against his own holdings and active for exactly 72 hours. 4 sealed envelopes. Inside each one, a card and a single handwritten note that said, "This is yours to use however you want for the next 3 days. No explanation required. No questions will be asked. W." He addressed envelopes to Patricia, Marcus, and Dale by name. The 4th envelope he left on the kitchen counter the evening before with a small sticky note on the outside that said simply, "For you." When Ruby arrived the next morning at 7:15 and saw it sitting beside the coffee maker, she looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up, opened it, read the note, and set it on the counter beside her coffee cup. She did not say anything. She began her morning the way she always did. Warren did not hover over the transaction alerts. That had never been the spirit of the thing. But he did check them when they came in, and what he saw over the first 24 hours from Patricia and Marcus and Dale made him feel warmly toward all 3 of them. Patricia booked 4 nights at a boutique hotel in Savannah, a city she had mentioned wanting to visit for years. Marcus ordered 2 pieces of professional kitchen equipment that he had talked about with the quiet longing of a craftsman who knew exactly what his work was missing. Dale drove to a dealership and put a down payment on a truck he had been describing in detail since the previous February, with the precise specifications of a man who had clearly been thinking about it for a very long time. Warren read each alert and nodded to himself. These were good people who knew what they wanted, and when given the chance, they went and got it without shame and without excess. There was nothing to judge in any of it. Ruby's card was silent for 18 hours. Not a single transaction. Warren told himself this meant nothing. People process things differently. Maybe she was planning. Maybe she was cautious. But by the following morning, when she arrived and said good morning and moved through the house exactly as she always did, with that same unhurried efficiency, he found himself watching her in a way he couldn't quite explain. Around 11 o'clock his phone buzzed. First transaction from Ruby's card. He picked it up immediately. A pharmacy on Flat Shoals Road in East Atlanta. $37. He stared at the number. Then he set the phone down. Then he picked it up again. $37 at a pharmacy. From a card with no spending limit. He sat with that for a while. By the end of the second day, there were 6 transactions total. The pharmacy. A Publix grocery store on Moreland Avenue. A medical supply company in East Point. A utility company, a payment made directly to someone else's account. A children's clothing store in Decatur. And a funeral home on Memorial Drive, where a payment of $420 had been applied to an existing balance. Warren read that list the way you read something that doesn't immediately make sense but that you know, instinctively, is about to matter a great deal. He asked his assistant to look quietly into each location and find whatever thread connected them, if there was one. The answer came back the next morning, and it rearranged something in his chest that had not moved in a long time. The pharmacy on Flat Shoals was in the neighborhood where a woman named Dolores Watkins lived. Dolores was 67 years old. She had spent 9 years as a cleaning contractor for one of Warren's commercial properties in East Point, until the property management company changed vendors and her contract ended. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. She was diabetic. The medication Ruby had purchased, insulin supplies and testing strips, was not fully covered under the limited insurance plan Dolores had managed to hold on to, and for the past several months she had been rationing what she had, stretching supplies further than was medically advisable because she could not afford the full amount every month. The grocery delivery had gone to Dolores's address. So had the medical supplies. Ruby had not stepped foot inside a single store for herself. Think about what that means for a moment. 3 days of unlimited access. Anything she wanted. And not 1 cent of it went toward herself. How does that land with you? What do you feel when you hear that? The utility payment had gone to the account of a man named Theodore Greer, 61 years old, who had worked maintenance at one of Warren's Nashville properties for several years until a back injury ended that job and left him in a difficult financial position from which he had never fully recovered. The children's clothing purchase had been delivered to an address in Decatur belonging to a woman named Anita Rousseau. Anita's husband, Calvin, had worked for Warren's construction firm until he died suddenly of a cardiac event 18 months earlier, a healthy man, 44 years old, here one day and gone the next, leaving Anita alone with 3 children under the age of 9 and a household that had gone from 2 stable incomes to none almost overnight. Warren had sent flowers when it happened. He had authorized a one-time bereavement payment through the company's standard protocol. He had not thought about Anita Rousseau or her 3 children since. Ruby had apparently never stopped thinking about them. And then there was the funeral home. $420 applied to an outstanding balance on the funeral service of a man named James Whitfield, 73 years old, who had done landscaping at Warren's Asheville property for 4 years and had passed away in January of that year without enough set aside to cover the full cost of his burial. His daughter, a woman named Marie, had been paying down the remaining balance in small installments every month, carrying that weight quietly the way people do when they are determined to give someone they loved a dignified ending. Ruby had never met Marie Whitfield face to face. She had heard about the situation through her church. She had known about that balance since February. And when she had 3 days and no limits, she had sat with all the things she could have chosen and she had chosen Marie Whitfield's grief instead. Warren did not sleep well that night. Not because he was upset, but because something had shifted and he was trying to understand what it was. He kept coming back to the same thought, turning it over like a stone. Ruby had known these people's names. She had known their situations. She had been paying attention for years to people who had passed through the edges of his world, and when they slipped through the cracks, she had noticed. She had even been helping where she could, out of her own paycheck, quietly, without telling anyone, and what the card had done was simply give her the capacity to do more of what she was already doing. That distinction struck him with a force he hadn't expected. She had not needed the money to become generous. She had been generous all along. The money had just removed the limit. He was in the kitchen when she arrived the next morning, sitting at the table in a way that he almost never did. She came through the back door and saw him there and paused just slightly, the way you pause when something is in a different place than you expected. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said. He said good morning. He asked her if she would sit down for a minute. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table, and he placed his phone between them with the transaction list on the screen and said, "I'd like you to help me understand this." She looked at the list for a moment. Then she looked at him. She was not embarrassed. She was not defiant. She had the expression of someone who had already decided what they would say if this conversation ever came, and had made their peace with it. She said, "Mr. Caldwell, I've worked in this house for a long time. And in that time, I've heard you mention a lot of people. And I've noticed that once some of those people are gone, the conversations about them stop. Most of them are fine. But some of them aren't, and I know some of them." He asked about Dolores. She said she had met Dolores at a church event 2 years earlier and had stayed in touch the way women sometimes do, a text here, a check-in there. She had known about the insulin situation for months. She had been contributing what she could from her own money. She said this without pride or performance, in the same tone she might use to describe any other fact about her week. He asked about the funeral home. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marie goes to my church. I've known about that balance since February. A man worked his whole life and his daughter shouldn't still be carrying that." Then she said something Warren would turn over in his mind for months afterward. She said, "I want you to know I wasn't trying to make a point about you. I know you're not a bad man. I just had a chance to help people who needed it, and I used it." He asked her why none of it had gone toward herself. She looked out the window for a long moment. She said, "I thought about my grandson's birthday. I thought about my car needing tires. I'm not going to pretend I didn't." She paused. "But I kept thinking about Dolores counting those strips every week. And I couldn't spend it on anything else while I knew that was happening. Ask yourself honestly, and this is not a question with a right or wrong answer, it is just an honest one, if you were in Ruby's position, if someone handed you 3 days and no limits and you knew what she knew, what would you have done first? Would the people you carry in the back of your mind have come before the things you've been wanting for yourself? There's no shame in the answer either way. But sit with the question for a moment, because it is the most important thing this story has to say. Warren spent the rest of that day making phone calls. He sorted out Dolores Watkins's insurance coverage gap in a single afternoon, a gap that should never have existed and that a 45-minute conversation with the right administrator was able to close permanently. He authorized a 6-month financial assistance payment to Anita Rousseau through a private family foundation he had established years ago and almost never used. He wrote a personal letter to Marie Whitfield and enclosed a check. That evening, at his kitchen table, he pulled up the records of every long-term contracted worker who had left employment connected to his companies over the last decade. He cross-referenced names. He asked his team what they actually knew about these people's circumstances. It was a longer list than he was comfortable with, and the gaps in what anyone knew were larger than he could justify. The following week he sat down with his estate attorney and the foundation's dormant board of directors and restructured everything. He funded the foundation properly for the first time, not as a tax instrument, not as a line item, but as a genuine operation with a mandate and a budget and a full-time director. The mandate was specific: identify and support workers and their families connected to his companies who had fallen into crisis. He asked Ruby if she would consider serving as a community liaison, not as a formality, but because he told her plainly that she knew things he didn't, and that what she knew had value. She told him she would think about it. 2 days later, she said yes. None of this appeared in a newspaper. Warren didn't want that. This was not a story for a press release or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a man in a large house, sitting with the truth about himself, deciding to do something different. Patricia came back from Savannah rested and happy, and Warren was genuinely glad for her. Marcus cooked a meal with his new equipment that everyone agreed was remarkable. Dale pulled up in his truck and Warren walked out and shook his hand and said it looked exactly right. He held nothing against any of them. They were good people who had done exactly what reasonable people do when given an unexpected gift. But there was something different now in the way he saw Ruby. Not pity, she would have hated that. Not sentimentality. Just the clear-eyed recognition that she had been carrying more awareness of the world around her than he had, quietly, without ceremony, for 11 years, and that he had been too comfortable and too busy to notice. He started asking about her grandson. His name was Marcus too, little Marcus, and he was turning 7 in April, and his favorite thing in the entire world was dinosaurs. Warren sent a birthday card. Ruby told him he really didn't need to do that. He said he knew he didn't need to. 3 months after the foundation was properly established, its first official grant went to Dolores Watkins, a full supplement covering her medical costs for the coming year. Dolores didn't know the details of how it had happened. She didn't know about the card or the experiment or any of it. She just received a letter one morning that said her coverage had been extended and that someone had arranged it on her behalf. She sat down at her kitchen table and cried for about 10 minutes. Then she called her daughter in Charlotte to tell her the news. The daughter cried too. Warren sold the Asheville cabin the following spring and directed the proceeds into the foundation. He started calling Sloane more than once a week. She flew to Atlanta in June, and the two of them spent several days going through the foundation's first full grant cycle together. Sloane said later it was the first time in her adult life she felt she truly understood the person her father was working to become. The Atlanta house felt different to Warren now. Not smaller. Not larger. Just different, in the way that a place feels different once the truth about it has been told out loud. Ruby still arrives at 7:15 every morning. She still knows where every creak in that floorboard is. She still moves through those rooms with the same unhurried care she has always had. The only thing that has changed is that now, when Warren hears the back door close at 3:30 in the afternoon and she is gone for the day, he doesn't just register the sound of an employee leaving. He wonders where she is going, and what quiet, specific, necessary thing she is about to do for someone who needs it. And he feels something he did not feel before, not guilt anymore, but something closer to resolve. The resolve to be a person who pays attention. To be someone who knows the names. Some people move through the world loudly. They make sure you know what they've given and what it cost them. And then there are people like Ruby, who carry whole lives in the back of their mind, names, needs, balances owed, sorrows unfinished, and who, when given 3 days and no limits, spend every cent of it on other people and go home at 3:30 without saying a word about it. That is not a small thing. That is one of the rarest things there is. Tell us in the comments, is there a Ruby in your life? Someone who gives without keeping score, who carries other people's weight so naturally you almost don't notice? And what would you do with 3 days and no limits? What would be the very first thing you reached for? We would genuinely love to hear your answers below. If this story meant something to you today, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that character is not what you do when everyone is watching, it is what you do when the only limit that exists is the one you put on yourself. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Folktales by Amos, and we will see you in the next one.